welcome to this week's edition of World Today. I'm Geeta Mohan. Now, everybody vividly remembers the U.S. Capitol attack on January 6, 2021. Nobody thought it could happen yet again. Not in the U.S., but yet another attack on another country's temple of democracy. Yes, in Brazil. Supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro invaded and ransacked 3 branches of the government in the capital, Brasilia: the presidential palace, Congress and the Supreme Federal Court, until they were eventually contained by security forces. Brazil is in the grip of a civil unrest after the elections led to the ousting of Bolsonaro and the return of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva as president. Here is a report.
Paulo! Boa tarde, Paulista!
Total absurdo,
Totally absurd. It's the worst moment in our history after 1964 dictatorship. I think everyone has appalled by the images we saw in the National Congress. So I think the response is this. It was well done occupying the Paulista. The fight now is to support the government that was democratically elected, and we are not going to leave the streets. That is the message.
eleito democraticamente. E não vamos sair das ruas. Esse é o recado.
He is the man in charge of the country, and he is the man whose supporters are responsible for what is happening in the country. The January 8th violence is the worst attack on Brazil's state institutions since its return to democracy in the 1980s. Supporters of far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro invaded the roof of Brazil's Congress on January 8 in a grim echo of the U.S. Capitol invasion 2 years ago by the followers of former U.S. President Donald Trump. Eyewitness video footage showed protesters smearing white paint on the walls outside the congressional entrance and shouting slogans against President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. While heavily armed police, some on horseback, had lined up in front of a camp outside the army headquarters where hardline supporters of far-right Bolsonaro had set up camp, nobody anticipated an attack of this nature, inviting wide criticism.
Let's be clear, this was an obvious and clear attack on a democratic process, and we condemn it, of course. I will also say that, as I've said to the Ambassador Bagley, that I'm very confident in her ability to represent the United States and to extend to President Lula all that we mean in terms of the work that we will do together as allies on some of the most important issues facing our world.
Meanwhile, Lula blames Bolsonaro for inflaming his supporters after a campaign of baseless allegations about election fraud after the end of his rule marked by divisive nationalist populism.
Eles estavam reivindicando golpes.
They were shouting for a coup. This was the only thing one could hear, that they were shouting for a coup. When the President of the Republic left office without a handover, and when the Vice President made a statement on television, they started to attack generals and attack the Vice President by calling him a coward, and that he betrayed the whole movement.
De covarde que tinha traído todo o movimento.
Jair Bolsonaro, on the other hand, flew to the United States days before his term in office ended and was admitted to a hospital in Orlando on Monday, complaining of intestinal pains related to a stabbing he suffered during the 2018 election campaign. This, even as more than 1,500 of his supporters were rounded up in Brasilia after storming the capital over the weekend. But in what could come as a shock to the outgoing president, the United States has said that he will either have to depart the country within 30 days or apply for a change of immigration status if they are no longer engaged in official business.
Leaving individuals aside, and generally speaking, if someone entered the United States on an A visa, which is essentially a diplomatic visa for foreign diplomats or heads of state, an A visa holder, if an A visa holder is no longer engaged in official business on behalf of their government, it is incumbent on that visa holder to depart the U.S. or to request a change to another immigration status within 30 days. That request for a change in visa status would be made to the Department of Homeland Security.
Bolsonaro, an acolyte of Trump's who has yet to concede defeat, peddled the false claim that Brazil's electronic voting system was prone to fraud, spawning a violent movement of election deniers. While the political jostle continues, the violence in Brasilia could amplify legal risk Bolsonaro faces. It also presents a headache for US authorities as they debate how to handle his stay in Florida. But the problems for Lula aren't over. The political impasse will make it more difficult for smooth functioning of his administration.
On Spotlight this weekend, we have Bruna Santos, who is a senior advisor at the Wilson Center, Brazil. She's joining me from Brasilia, the capital city, where all the action is taking place. Bruna, many thanks for joining us here on India Today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure.
Bruna, let's begin with what really happened when, over the weekend, the institutions of democracy, the Supreme Court, Presidential Palace, Congress were attacked, ransacked. What's the status of action that will be taken by the Lula administration, and how are people really viewing what really happened in Brazil?
Well, first of all, worth saying that last year's election provided us evidence that Brazil is divided. Jair Bolsonaro lost to Lula by less than 2 percentage points. So what we see is that the confrontations that happened on Sunday are a demonstration of an expression of outrage from an extreme right Bolsonaro supporters who alleged electoral fraud and political bias by the Supreme Court and Brazilian institutions. So just to put into perspective the magnitude of the events that happened, it's as if what would happen if Trump supporters on January 6, 2021 stormed and damaged the White House, the Supreme Court, and the Senate, and the House of Chambers. So that's the magnitude. What's coming next? Lula has installed what we call a federal intervention. Federal intervention is when the federal government takes control of policing in the capital. In the federal district, where Brasilia is the policing is a responsibility of the state government. So now Lula took control of policing in the capital, and also along with the Supreme Court and more specifically Judge Alexandre de Moraes, Lula is now unfolding a number of investigations, a number of harassments, and also I would say that more and more investigations on the actual police force is also being made. Right. Something was missed during that, right?
Right. Bruna, you make a very important point when you say the House is divided, the country is divided, and there are a huge number of people who are supporting Bolsonaro. In that, how do you see the country move forward, even if the Lula administration wants to legislate? Forget about what's happening right now and the crisis or the violence. How do the legislations really work if there is so much of trouble? How does the country come out of the COVID crisis, the economic crisis? How does a country really function?
There is one thing that is worth saying. I think a number of Bolsonaro supporters, people who voted for Bolsonaro, but are not supporting the violent reactions and riots that happened on Sunday. So it's more like the far right and extreme supporters of Bolsonaro. They are supportive of what's going on. A number of Lula's opponents in state level, for example, the governors of different states in Brazil who were not supporters of Lula before, are now positioning pro-Lula's decision on these events. So I think at some point the center is actually more unified than ever in terms of, okay, we are now protecting the democracy, because the attacks that happened on Sunday were not attacks against Lula, were attacks against the democratic state in Brazil. Our institutions were attacked. So I think that even though it shows that the country is divided, there are challenges coming next. We had a survey released this week showing that 10% of respondents just classified the arrests. The arrests have happened as justifiable in part, and 36% were in favor of a military intervention to annul the presidential election. So that's a significant number of people. So it's yet to be seen how this is going to unfold in terms of the reactions to possible new riots throughout the country. But at the same time, I believe that there is a reasonable part of the opposition for Lula that are actually more unified than ever in terms of protecting the democracy.
Well, it is a major developing story, and we'll be tracking all the developments from Brazil as also what really happens to Bolsonaro. Like you just said, the fact that Bruna, the fact that he has not conceded defeat yet and he's yet to return to Brazil. So we'll have to wait and see. On that note, thank you so much for joining us here on World Today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Much of the arguments aside, let's just agree that the U.S. has a border crisis, and a major one at that. Why is that? It is because of the Title 42 policy. Should it stay or should it go? The Trump-era order exploited public health justifications during the COVID pandemic to turn away thousands of migrants. Title 42 policy was originally due to expire on the 21st of December, but 2 days before the deadline, Chief Supreme Court Justice John Roberts blocked its termination. Now, despite all the dark predictions over what will happen whenever Title 42 is lifted, the southern border already is in the midst of a record-setting migration surge that is likely to persist for the foreseeable future. So how are the Democrats going to handle this crisis with the Republicans in control of the Congress?
Cold, freezing temperatures across the US-Mexico border. No let-up for the hundreds of migrants who are sheltering in border areas of the United States, where shelters and federal facilities are out of capacity. While the Biden administration seeks a solution to the migrant crisis, the US Supreme Court has ruled that the Trump-era Title 42 policy, a legal provision used to expel asylum seekers, will remain in place for now, disallowing these migrants from entering USA. The crisis is so big that it led to the Three Amigos Summit, which is the meeting of leaders of the US, Canada and Mexico, a meeting that did not take place during the Trump administration.
As was mentioned by all of us in one way or another, this has been the greatest migration in human history around the world, as well as in this hemisphere. And when I got elected, the first major piece of legislation I introduced was to reform the immigration process, to make it more orderly, to make sure people have access under the law. And so what we found out, and not just in my visit to El Paso, but before that, we found out is that our Republican friends and a few Democrats are very critical of what's going on the border, but yet refused to even look at the detailed document I submitted for the Congress to consider to reform the process completely.
The court's decision was in response to an emergency appeal from some Republican-led states who had asked for the policy to remain in place. The Biden administration did recognize that the end of Title 42 policy would lead to disruption and a temporary increase in unlawful border crossings, and therefore came up with a 6-pillar plan. While that is not needed now, On the border, local governments and humanitarian organizations have warned that they are already overburdened and ill-prepared for an additional influx of asylum seekers. During October 2021 and September 2022, almost 3 million people entered illegally into the United States as per available data. Data on the website of US Customs and Border Protection shows 23,78,944 crossers encountered by the agency. Add to that the estimated 6 lakh illegal crossers who got away without any contact with the border patrol, bringing it close to 3 million border crossers in a single year, according to Washington Examiner. Border city of El Paso declared emergency as migrants were no longer assured safety and the city was struggling with resources to provide shelter to migrants, which meant that several hundreds had to put up in the open in the cold.
Quiero dejar de manifiesto que le he solicitado.
I want to say that I respectfully requested President Biden to insist to the US Congress to regularize migration status of millions of Mexicans that for years have been living, working and contributing to the development of this great nation, that is the United States.
The leaders of the Mexico, Canada and the United States at the North American Leaders Summit struggled to handle an influx of migrants and to crack down on smugglers who profit from persuading people to make the dangerous trip to the United States. With the Democrats and Republicans at war on immigration issue, a resolution does not seem to be in sight.
Do you think the president, in more than 40 years of being elected, why do you think he finally went to the border? Because we were sworn in. He knows what's coming. You've got to secure your border. And we're going to use every power we have to make sure we protect this country and look out for the American taxpayer.
Though Title 42 has become central to the US border crisis, it's not an immigration law, and it will therefore have to go at some point. While the Supreme Court ruling on keeping Title 42 is in place for now, it is only delaying the inevitable. The immediate concern, however, is the humanitarian crisis. One person has already died after falling to death while climbing the border wall, as per a report. The crisis also highlights the failure of President Joe Biden's administration to reach a solution and of the Congress to reform immigration laws.
Executions are becoming commonplace in Iran, weaponizing death penalty to punish those who have raised their voices against the rights-curtailing regime in Tehran. Iran has executed 4 people in connection with nearly 4 months of demonstrations since the death in custody of Mahsa Amini following her arrest for allegedly violating the country's dress code for women. The regime speaks of foreign hand in meddling by the US. Even if that were true, it does not take away from the fact that women are an oppressed lot under this Islamic regime. International condemnation aside, can this barbarity be brought to an end?
Death penalty to frighten the public and crush dissent. This tool is being used by the Iranian government. The charges: allegedly killing members of the security forces during nationwide protests that followed the death of the 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman Mahsa Amini on September 16th. Mohammad Mehdi Karami and Syed Mohammad Hosseini were 2 such men convicted of killing Ruhollah Ajmain, a member of the besieged paramilitary force militia.
I hit him in the head with a piece of stone. Then I punched him in the head 3 times.
The 2 of them were hanged to death. The latest executions bring to fore the number of protesters officially known to have been executed in the aftermath of the unrest. According to Amnesty International, Iranian authorities are seeking the death penalty for at least 26 others in what it called sham trials designed to intimidate protesters. While the world is watching these horrors in shock and dismay, the Supreme Leader is pointing to the West for the unrest that has engulfed his nation.
The hands of foreigners were obvious. What America did and various European countries did.
Iranian envoys serving abroad are being summoned and warnings are being issued.
Separately of the legal system under which sanctions and listing take place, I have furthermore given instructions today for the Iranian ambassador to be summoned to the Foreign Office once again to make it unmistakably clear that the brutal repression, oppression and terror against their own population as well as the recent two execution will not remain without consequence.
Nicht ohne Folge bleiben.
Even the Pope has appealed to Iran to stop the state executions, which will not solve the problems of Iran today.
The right to life is also threatened in those places where the death penalty continues to be imposed, as is the case in these days in Iran. Following the recent demonstrations and demanding greater respect for the dignity of women, the death penalty cannot be employed for a purported state justice, since it does not constitute a deterrent nor render justice to victims, but only fuels the thirst for vengeance.
Ne offre giustizia alle vittime, ma alimenta solamente la sete di vendetta.
Since Amini's death, protesters from all walks of life have taken to the streets, calling for the downfall of the country's clerical rulers, with women taking off and burning their headscarves in the fury across the country. It included top Iranian actress Taraneh Ali Dosti, who is best known for her role in The Salesman, which won an Academy Award in 2017. While she was later released on bail, there are scores who are still lodged in Tehran's notorious Evin prison. Iran is at the cusp of change, and Iran's clerical rulers are facing their worst legitimacy crisis in the past 4 decades.
That's all in this edition of World Today, but before we go, we'll reiterate the concerns on climate change. Climate justice and climate change are the hot topics when it comes to all the countries who have really raised concerns with regards to how it is impacting the world. The latest Pacific storm unleashed torrential downpours and damaging winds in California, with mudslides cutting off highways and entire communities facing evacuation orders. Heavy to excessive rainfall was expected across the state. In San Jose, a power line came down on top of a bakery. The visuals clearly show how terrible the impact of climate change is. On that note, take care and goodbye.